you to our faculty and our university, in this case, to our space, our virtual space. We are very pleased to introduce the 5th edition of the Tarragona International Environmental Law Colloquium, also known as TIEC. As you can imagine, this is a different edition than that we had thought. However, and bearing in mind that this has been one of the few seminars surviving also the COVID-19, we would like to thank all the members of the organizing committee, all the members of the scientific committee, and especially you, all our young scholars who have been this possible, who maintain or keep this light on here in the URV. Thank you for the seminar. Thank you for making this seminar possible and making it a reference here at the URV. While in each edition, different well-known international scholars have been speakers and also attendees to this seminar, showing us the high quality and expertise of those having been here before. This edition has consolidated this trend, and we may see the complete and interesting program and also the quality of the contributions to be made in next sessions. The theme of the main focus of this 5th TIEC is gender and environmental law, challenges and opportunities for promoting the role of gender in environmental justice. Let me say that I'm not an expert on this specific topic mainly, but I have been working on gender studies up to now for many years, not so much, I should say so many, sorry. But I would like to highlight that this ought to be a topic, and it has finally arrived. We are going to talk about gender and environmental justice, and I'm very glad of doing that. Why? Because gender is probably the most crucial axis on which we build our identities, we construct our social relations, and also social structures. Definitely, it situates ourselves in societies, situate each of us in our society, but also it constructs our relations with the environment. Feminist and ecological claims emphasizes the need to rethink our relations, to rethink our connections between ourselves and the others, but also between ourselves and the environment. We have learned that there are some other forms of doing things, but also this epidemic experience confirms that at the end, we must relocate or resituate life at the center again. This is much more than a distributive issue. This is why I think that in this context, TIEC have brought together convenient points of view, and I am sure that you will generate discussions concerning this issue. I will wish you so much inspiration and good work, because we need to promote this approach. So welcome and bon courage. We hope that you, when this happens, when this finishes, all of you could come back to the TIEC, or come back to the CEDAT, or come to the URV, at least physically, and we can discuss all the results, of the outcomes, all the, let's say, all the idea, or share, or the networks, or the outcomes you have been working on, or at least all the results of your researches that you are going to discuss in this virtual seminar. I will say that I hope you enjoy Tarragona. That's not possible, so this is another reason to go back when you could, or when this would be possible. But I hope that at least this will be a beginning of a very fruitful and interesting academic friendship between the CEDAT and all of you. At least we will welcome you here at the Zoom space, but we will welcome you, we hope, at the CEDAT. And having said that, I will wish you an inspiring discussion and work together. Many thanks again to all the organizing committee. I said before that mainly it is composed by our young scholars, but the TIEC is the best example that our young scholars are very compromised with this kind of high experts and high value seminar scientific meetings with all these background of all these contributors to the seminar. So many thanks again. Welcome to the TIEC and hope to see you soon in Tarragona. Many thanks.
Thank you, dear Victor, always for giving us your support, and of course for the welcome words, but for giving us your support on the colloquium and on every activity that we ask you to help us. So we are really honored to have you also as part of the TIEC committee, organizing committee, sorry. So good evening, everyone. My name is Beatriz Felipe Pérez, and I am part of the organizing committee. On behalf of the Tarragona Environmental Law Student Association, we are deeply honored to welcome you to the 5th Tarragona International Environmental Law Colloquium, which, as Victor already mentioned, we will deal on gender and environmental law, challenges and opportunities for promoting the role of gender in environmental justice. First of all, we would like to thank the Rovira y Virgili University, the Student Council, AGAUR, of course the CEDAT for their support, and the rest of entities which have contributed to the success of the colloquium. We are also honored to have with us Professor Karen Morrow from Swansea University, Professor Amanda Fadigas from Universitat de Girona, and Professor Lina Muñoz Ávila from the Universidad del Rosario for their participation as keynote speakers. They are outstanding researchers and practitioners in the environmental law field, and they have an extended career in gender studies. We are really happy to have you as part of this colloquium too. We would also like to say thank you to the scientific committee, which was Karen Morrow again, Victor, and Thais Ricarte for reviewing the received abstracts. Thank you so much. We would like to especially thank the attendees for taking part of this event. We highly encourage you to engage in the colloquium and take an active role in the discussions in each panel. You are very welcome to make questions and we will try to resolve them. As you know, the colloquium aims to provide a forum for scholars with different backgrounds to present and discuss their research and work in progress. This event also seeks to create a friendly environment for meeting and interacting with fellow students and colleagues that share a common interest for environmental law. Therefore, we are more than happy to welcome the panelists and poster presenters. It is really nice to have guests from so many different nationalities and backgrounds. We are also glad to meet familiar faces in this 5th edition and also welcome new colleagues to the TIEC community. Last but not least, I would like to acknowledge the work done by the organizing committee, especially to Javier Francisco Arenas, Marcos de Armentera, Estefania Asensio, Clara Esteve, Gabriela Faud, Daniel Iglesias, Paulina Junca, Gaston Medici, Laura Presiche, Malca San Lucas, and Patricia Sangama. It's been many months working on this and we hope we all enjoy it. Every year, organizing the colloquium is a challenge. But as you know, in this 5th edition, we have had to cope with an extra challenge, which was the COVID-19 and the mobility restrictions. We were not sure whether to continue with the organization of the colloquium or not. But after some meetings, we decided to go ahead and continue and celebrate it as a virtual conference for the first time. We thought it was worth it to persist with our academic objectives in this increasingly complex world. This meant substantial changes in comparison with previous editions of the colloquium. Sadly, we will not have our famous dinner and the social activities that we enjoyed as much as the colloquium, but we have tried to make it as interactive as possible. We hope we all have a great experience during these 2 evenings. Just let me explain some few points on the logistic issues, and we will start with the first panel, just 2 or 3 minutes more, and that will be. So, as you know, today and tomorrow we will have 3 keynote speakers, 9 oral presentations, and 6 poster presentations, all organized in 4 main panels. In case you haven't, you can see all the details in our website. Regarding the structure in each panel, the keynote speakers will have 20 minutes and the presenters have 10 minutes each. We will use the rest of the sessions for discussion, questions and answers for all, for the keynote speakers together. Please, the presenters who are not doing their presentation in the moment, please keep the microphones and cameras off while you are not speaking. The audience are more than welcome to make questions through the question and answer feature, and there will be one member of the organizing committee collecting all these questions. You can also use the chat, for share any relevant information. And I wanted to tell you that the session will be recorded, and it's already actually being broadcasted live through Facebook. So people who's watching us through Facebook, you can also make questions there, and we will try to answer later on. Finally, I just wanted to say that we have created a shared document for trying to build conclusions together. So the aim of the document is, as I said, to build these collective conclusions, and we will share a link at the end of each session, and then you will be able to add all your comments. There are a few tickets left for the next panels, so you are more than welcome to register in case you haven't. We hope this colloquium provides us not only essential knowledge, but also a great opportunity to share experience on gender and environmental law. Thank you everyone again. And let's move on directly to the first panel, actually to the first keynote. So let me introduce Professor Karen Morrow. Karen Morrow is professor in environmental law at the Swansea University, formerly Leeds University, Durham University, the Queen's University of Belfast, and the University of Buckingham. She is founding co-editor of the Journal of Human Rights and the Environment. She has also published widely on public participation in environmental law with particular emphasis on gender. We are really glad, Karen, for your participation in the colloquium and in other many events of the CEDAT in which you have already taken part. The title of Karen's presentation is Gender and the Need to Hear and Heed the Overlooked in Sustainable-Based Global Environmental Governance. Karen, you are very, very welcome. Thank you so much. And you have the floor for the next 20 minutes. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Let me just get the share screen on. Okay, so I see I have successfully unmuted. I've got my camera on. You will gather from Beatriz's very kind introduction that I'm old. I've been an academic for a long time and tech is not my thing. Can I first thank the university, the law school, CEDAT, and most of all, the organizing committee for inviting me to be as close to being with you today as is possible. I was so excited when I saw the topic that had been selected for this year's colloquium, and so pleased to be involved. Can I also say how much I enjoyed looking at the abstracts that were submitted? It was fantastic to have a snapshot of all the dynamic and exciting scholarship that's going on across the globe in this area. And the last thing I want to say before I get down to business, as it were, is that I'm so pleased that you decided to go ahead despite COVID. I actually think in many ways, the COVID situation tells us that more than ever, these issues are important. So the panel asked me, the organizing panel asked me to talk about gender issues in a bit more general way than I would normally do. Most of my work looks at gender and climate change. But actually, whenever I started to think about gender and environmental governance in current practice, I realized that there are many much bigger issues that we need to look at to set gender in context. And I suppose, to my mind, the ultimate context that we're working in is the search for sustainability-based global environmental governance. Our systems to engage with each other and the planet are ultimately going to stand or fail on whether or not they are actually sustainable in the literal sense of the word. Can they be perpetuated? Can they help humanity to not just survive, but to flourish in a world that is actually conducive to that? And I think they can, but I think to do that, we need to remember that sustainability-based governance is everyone's governance. It's not just governance for the powerful. It's not just governance for the rich. It's not just governance for men or for women. It's governance for everybody. And not everyone has an equal voice in our system. So I suppose the first thing that I'd like you to reflect on, and I think this is actually really important for the discussions that will follow over the next couple of days, is that when we look at giving voice to people who are overlooked in our governance regimes, we're not doing that because we're great at recognizing the equality of humanity. Law reminds us that we're really bad at it. And in fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think, has to be our starting point here. Remember, the Universal Declaration was adopted, at least in part, in response to some of the worst behavior we have ever seen humanity visit on one another. And the aspirations and reflection that brought about led the international community to make some very important statements about the nature of humanity and what it means. So the Universal Declaration is founded in its preamble on a recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. Not just the members that certain governments think deserve it, not just the members we think are virtuous or deserving, all. We have rights simply by virtue of being human. The preamble goes on to say that it subscribes to the equal rights of men and women. Again, laudable, difficult to disagree with, but preambles are areas in international documents that allow the luxury of making fine statements but not necessarily meaning to follow them up. Where we get down to business is when we look at the substantive provisions of the Universal Declaration. And for our purposes today, Article 2 is the foundation to all discussion about rights, justice, and participation in the regimes that govern our world. And just to remind you, or for those who aren't familiar with it, Article 2 tells us that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Our rights and our rights to be involved in the direction our planet take rest simply on us being human. And that is the most important thing I think we can remember. Now I'm trying to see my slides. Okay, so why are the issues that we're looking at now sustainability issues? Quite simply, any problem that we face as a species that goes to our survival and our flourishing is, by its very definition, a sustainability issue. Our economies and our societies need to be sustainable. They need to not outstrip the resources of the planet on which we live and on which we depend. They need not to exploit nature, of which we are a part, unsustainably. So the recognition of sustainability, the economic, environmental, and social aspects of human endeavor or activity or interlink is an important place to start. but it is just a start. Recognizing that isn't enough. We've recognized that for a very long time now. We need to act on this recognition. And one of the things that you find whenever you've looked at international environmental law for a long time, as I have, is that the environmental aspects of sustainability are very much discussed in the international community. The economic aspects of sustainability are even more discussed in the international community. But actually, the social limb of sustainability has been relatively neglected until now. And my personal view is that because we haven't given sufficient heed or credence to the human social aspects of sustainability, it's one of the reasons why it remains something that's a great idea on paper, but not well developed in practice. And I was looking for an image that would support the idea that the social element of sustainability was important, because it's interesting and useful and sometimes can give us a great message on what concepts look like, to use an image. And I could find hardly any. I could find lots with pictures of factories, lots with pictures of money, very few that had anything to do with people. And this image is one of the few that does. And it actually, I think, links together the human and environmental aspects of what we're doing quite well. It's not perfect, doesn't have anything that pictorially represents the economy, but it's as good an image as I could find. Maybe that's a project worth working on, to look at a better way of pictorially representing sustainability that's communicatable to everybody, regardless of language, age, educational attainment, etc. But it's significant that this is the area where least progress, I think, has been made. So why does it matter? Well, because our understanding of the environment, the economy, and the links between them are things that are easily reducible to technical considerations. We can count, we can measure. We have a huge amount of data about the human-environment relationship. But data and knowledge are not the same thing. And if we're really going to be able to work on the links between humanity and environment in ways that work, we need to have an internalized knowledge of what it means to be human in the context of an environment that our activities are threatening. If we're really going to achieve change, if we're going to progress on sustainability, we need to do this based on active and inclusive human agency. And that's where the emphasis on the social limb of sustainability lies. But we need to change the way we look at human agency. Human agency is not the property of those in government. It is not the property of the wealthy. It is not the property of powerful. It is the property of all. And to give effect to that, we've got to give voice to all in our environmental governance structures. But even that is not enough. It is not enough for people to be given the opportunity to have a say. We've got to really hear what people are saying. We've got to actually take it into account. We've got to act in it. We've got to add the things that are missing from sustainability governance to make it work. So what does all of this have to do with gender? Well, one of the ways I found a way into thinking about this was looking at the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its banner pledge, its rallying cry of leave no one behind. And that, I think, is a very simple message. It's only 4 words, but it actually speaks to core concerns about the nature of the way we make environmental decisions as a species. And gender is one of the axes of exclusion. It's one of the areas where people are left behind. On narrow gender equality, we've become increasingly aware that women tend to be at the bottom of the pile when it comes to positions of power, privilege, economic security, etc. But actually that doesn't tell the whole story. As long ago as 2013, Ban Ki-moon added to our consideration of gender by saying that discrimination on sexual orientation and gender identity is one of the great neglected human rights challenges of our time. And that human rights perspective invited us to take a broader look at gender, to look at gender beyond the traditional and outmoded male-female binary into a broader understanding of gender and LGBTQI issues. And I'm going to look about that a little bit more in a moment. But one thing I would say is that human rights, gender, and equality are all under threat, particularly from the far right globally, where there is a concentrated backlash on gender rights that applies to women's rights and also applies to LGBTQI communities. And we're seeing attempts to roll back women's rights in places as diverse as the US and certain parts of Europe even, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. And for LGBT people, we're seeing worse. We're seeing state-mandated persecution, rolling back on rights entitlements where those have been gained, and a tremendous extra layer of inequality that you need to keep in mind when you're working in this area. Why does it matter? Well, our system has structural inequality built into it, and that equality is systemic. Whose voices dominate in our global institutions? Essentially, according to Annika Harry, writing in 2019, she said that to be anything other than a white, cisgendered, non-disabled male puts you at a disadvantage. I would add to that, I would say it's not enough to say that we're talking about privileged white, mostly white, not always, cisgendered, non-disabled males. We're also talking about the wealthy, the healthy, and the educated. There are certain voices that dominate in our system. And the systems benefit the people who run them. So essentially, if we have a status quo that privileges certain voices over others, dissent is drowned out, and the system is organized to the benefit of those who control it. And this prompts asking very difficult questions. And these questions come up in many contexts. The Black Lives Matters movement globally at the minute raises precisely this sort of intersectional coverage. And in fact, Rennie Edo-Lodge, who's one of the leading British commentators in this area, is an intersectional feminist scholar. And when looking at race issues, she applies a lens that we can apply just as well to gender issues here. Who really wants to be alerted to a structural system that benefits them at the expense of others? Does the global polis really want to be told that there are structural inequalities in this system, they benefit you at the expense of everyone else? No, they probably don't. Having said that, in the environmental field, we do actually have something that acts to our advantage, I think, in this respect. The ways of behaving and the sorts of decisions and policies we've made that we've done in the past that benefit those in entrenched power positions are actually now proving to be destructive to the very interests of those who've promoted them. The environmental degradation that affects those who are effectively disenfranchised or not powerful also affects the powerful too. And we're getting to the point where we can no longer avoid those problems. You can't buy your way out of a lack of clean air. You can't buy your way into protecting biodiversity. Once the last tiger is gone, you can't recreate it with money, a paper tiger, I suppose, quite literally, none of these things work. So actually, I think at this point, we may have a lever in promoting conversations about change in environmental governance to deal with structural inequality, because the way that things have been done up until now is no longer sustainable, to come back to that word. And gender is one of the things that we need to address in this. It's not the only one. Intersectional analysis among feminists would tell you that race, color, ability or disability, age, class, all of these factors are relevant frames of exclusion too. So I don't mean to ignore them, but I can only talk about one thing at a time, and certainly in 20 minutes I can't cover them all. But none of us is one thing. We are all intersectional human beings. We are all many things at once. But the approach that gender scholars have discovered is actually replicable to other types of exclusion as well. So how do we understand gender? You've got to see it as multifaceted. Annika Kronsel, excellent gender scholar, drawing on Licky from 2020, produced this brilliant and very brief, but I think very all-encompassing understanding of the nature of gender and the problems that it raises. So she tells us that gender is expressed at many levels. It relates, yes, to individual identity. More than that, it extends to things like knowledge production, to interaction between individuals, to institutional and cultural practices. It's both material and ideational. And this is probably the crucial point. It's a power relation. Gender is all about power in this context, and in groups and out groups. So it intersects with and is interrelated to other forms of power and to differences in political agency and access to resources. And it's expressed in many influential ways. I suppose one of the things that's been on my mind lately is gender and risk. Now, I've always thought about that in terms of climate change, but actually when you look at the COVID crisis, you can see quite distinct patterns emerging globally between states that are female-led and states that are male-led, and they're very different attitudes to risk in the COVID crisis. And maybe women are more aware of risk because we know what it's like to be marginalized, we know what it's like to be at risk. If you've never experienced the adverse consequences of risk, as many men, certainly white, powerful, educated, wealthy, healthy men have not, it's more difficult to empathize, it's more difficult to understand, to put yourself in those shoes. So gender does change the way we do things. It changes the sorts of decisions we make. It changes the way we view the world. So what about gender itself? Well, gender is not only women's issues. One of the things that annoys me as a woman is whenever we're described as minority, we're not. We're half the population. Looking at women and gender, we should have a broader perspective. And you can see from this slide that there are lots of different ways of looking at gender. There are many different acronyms. I'm not going to go through them. You can read them. What I would say that matters about these things is recognizing that gender is more than just man/women. Gender is a socially mandated way of looking at people in lots of different categories, and lots of those categories are used to exclude and to oppress. And what really matters, regardless of how we look at gender, is inclusivity, equality, and intersectionality, making our approach to rights for all humans exactly that. So it's a matter of principle, equality, it's a matter of practicality. And Beatriz, I can see you calling me down, so I'll be quick on the next couple of slides. So gender is important because it's a source of vulnerability. People suffer who are not creating environmental problems and who have no voice in how to deal with them. So it's a significant axis of exclusion from voice, but it's not the only one. You know, you look at the stats worldwide and, you know, you're talking average 23% women parliamentarians. That's nowhere near good enough. And representation for other gender categories is even lower. By excluding gender relevance from our legislatures, etc., we're excluding our understanding of the full gamut or range of gendered lived experience. And that means we're missing a lot of vulnerabilities, but we're also missing opportunities to develop human agency. People are brilliant at being forced to develop coping mechanisms and also at understanding the world in which they live in and what they interact with every day. If we exclude women's voices, if we exclude other gender groups' voices, we exclude the learning that they have to share about what that is like. So yes, data, the science is hugely important. Knowledge and knowing about lived human experience and listening to and learning to that is important, in fact, crucial if we're going to successfully harness human agency. One of the things that's become clear to me in preparing this talk is that when we're looking at women's issues, the work is not yet done. But when we're looking at LGTBIQI issues, there is virtually no data. There are some sporadic recognitions in UNEP, for example, and the Food and Agricultural Organization about LGBT issues, but comparatively little. It's sporadic. We need the data, we need people researching in these areas to show where the vulnerabilities are and where the agency is. We need these to make the equality and justice arguments persuasive. It's not just, though, about helping those who are vulnerable. It's about helping ourselves as a species, using all of our agency, all of our skill to develop. And I'll finish off with Annika Harry. We have to trade our outrage to outcome and to spend it instead on change. It's very easy whenever you look at exclusion and injustice to be outraged. And you should be outraged. It's good to be outraged, but you need to be more than that. You need to be active. You need to use that to drive your research, to drive our understanding of how we can be better humans on a better planet. And you need to use it to fuel change. And there I will stop.
Thank you so much, Karen. It was a very interesting presentation, especially you doing this effort of giving us a broader perspective on the topic. That was really interesting, and I loved the last sentence, but you said that we have to be better humans and have a better planet, and that was really inspiring. So let's move now to the first panelist. We have now Carlotta Garofalo from University of Graz, and the title of her presentation is Public Litigation, a Tool to Advance Women's Rights in a Changing Climate. Thank you so much, Carlotta, for joining us.
Yeah, hello, and good afternoon to everybody from whichever part of the world you're listening. I will just share my screen now. Yes. Okay. So my name is Carlotta Garofalo, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Graz. I'm also a member of the CLIM Law Research Center, a research center about climate change law in particular, and of the doctoral program on climate change. Today, I'm happy to present to you an idea of a paper about public climate litigation or public environmental litigation as a tool to advance women's rights in the context of climate change. So, when we talk about climate change and gender, we need to introduce the concept of vulnerability. Vulnerability is the sum or the addition of two factors: geographic exposure and adaptive capacity. By adaptive capacity, we specifically mean to have means, social and economic resources to cope or to adapt with climate change. So we know that the global south, developing countries, are going to be more affected by climate change, and we know that poor people are going to be more affected than rich. Then when we also consider that women are the most of the global poor, and they are often more reliant on natural sources, is easy to conclude that women are more vulnerable to climate change. To put it simply, this is because women have less of three fundamental human resources. They have less time, they have less land, they have less voice. They have less time because normally, due to social construction, they are tasked, they are charged with tasks such as taking care of the household or care work, which leave them with less time for education or for income generating opportunities. They have less land, meaning that they have less right to the land, and we will see this more deeply afterwards. They have less voice, meaning that they are less able, they are more marginalized when it comes to participating to decision making, and in particular to environmental decision making. Gender vulnerability can also be easily translated in the human rights language. So being more vulnerable to climate change, women, human rights to life, to health, to education, to property, to participation, and to equality is violated as a consequence of climate change. So my idea is to look into 3 case studies. The first 2 are located in South Asia. In particular, with regard to Pakistan, one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, I want to understand whether public interest litigation can become a tool for advancing women's rights, and in particular, the right to a clean energy transition. Secondly, with regard to India, I want to understand whether litigation can help in improving the relationship between women and their right to the land. And finally, I also want to understand whether not only litigation, but also environmental impact assessment can become in the future a tool for including women and gender issues more in general in environmental decision making. And for this particular question, I've chosen South Africa as a possible case study. So public interest litigation is a particular form of litigation which developed in certain countries, including the United States and India, and is very different from the kind of litigation we are used to. The main difference is that the applicant in public interest litigation does not need to prove to have a special interest or a special right involved in the cause. In India, this formal litigation was emerged in the 70s to help the more disadvantaged part of society, so the economically, socially disadvantaged, the disabled, and the poor people to approach directly the court. So, as said, the applicant does not need to prove to have standing in the case. Also, there is not any any need for formality in public interest litigation. There have been cases, especially in India, where people were applying to the court with letters or even with postcards. Thirdly, the courts in India and in Pakistan also have been particularly creative in interpreting fundamental rights in order to give to the people real social guarantees. And finally, in public interest litigation, there is also more flexibility when it comes to remedy. So courts do not limit to take a decision against state authorities or competent authorities, but they can even supervise over the enforcement, the concrete enforcement of this decision. Now, with regard to Pakistan, a case needs to be mentioned, and this is the Maria Khan case. The Maria Khan case is a climate lawsuit against the state of Pakistan for the failure to enforce the commitment regarding, in particular, the mitigation policies. So Pakistan had committed with the international community to reduce its greenhouse gas emission, but also to take some specific policy when it comes to energy security and sustainable energy. And it did not apparently adopt the policies that had promised. What is particularly interesting and relevant for our purposes is that this case was brought for the first time by a group of women that propose themselves as a vulnerable group to climate change. So for the first time, a human rights-based case is brought by women, and the issue of gender vulnerability is brought to the court in a climate change context. When it comes to India, the issue that I found particularly interesting is the one of land rights. Now, some facts that one needs to know is that in India, the most of the economically active women are working in the agricultural sector. Nevertheless, these women often do not own the land, because they cannot inherit the land, and even in the rare cases in which the male inheritance rule is not followed, they do not have effective control over the land. Now, there is a direct relationship between the lack of land rights and the welfare of women and children, and also between secure land rights and food security and land productivity. And this relationship becomes even stronger when we consider climate change as a factor. As we know, climate change will exacerbate resource scarcity and poverty. So public interest litigation can be, I think, a tool through which women can complain about this specific form of gender inequality. As we saw, as an economic and disadvantaged group, rural women would have an easier time approaching the court. Moreover, public interest litigation has been used as a tool for legal change, as well as a tool for law enforcement. And also, I think that framing a potential women's rights case in the context of climate change could be helpful to raise the urgency of the case at the eyes of the courts of India, since also the climate change issue has been considered as a priority matter in the case of India. Finally, I've considered the South African case as a case to reflect on with regard to the possibility of thinking of the environmental impact assessment procedure as a tool to include women in environmental decision making or climate decision making. The reason why I focus on South Africa are plural, not only because women also in South Africa are a marginalized group, not only because of the high number of women which are employed in the rural sector and who have less rights when it comes to the land, but also because very recently there was an interesting climate case in 2017, the Tamabetsi case, where the High Court of Cape Town, if I'm not mistaken, affirmed that climate impacts must be considered in the environmental impact assessment procedure. Therefore, I think it would be interesting to see whether local communities and also women can use the environmental impact assessment procedure as a tool to have their gender vulnerability discussed in the process of decision making over projects which have a particularly severe impact on the environment and on climate change. And also I've considered South Africa because the government and also the international level, there seems now to be an attention towards the issue of women inclusion and gender mainstreaming. And just recently, the government of South Africa has released a gender mainstreaming strategy in the climate change context. So it would be interesting to go deeper into these kind of issues. To conclude, I've argued that climate litigation can be a tool to improve women's rights when it comes to the land, to participation, to energy security. Of course, there are some limitations and some challenges that need to be taken into account. Law and litigation cannot be considered the solution to all problems, also because gender is a social cultural factor, and therefore the overcoming of gender inequality has to come together with social change, and also as it has been explained by Professor Morrow, gender is just one of the grounds for inequality, together with other factors, class, race, and so on. But I think that the issue worth some attention also because climate litigation has been a tool, or is becoming a tool, for climate victims to become positive agents for climate action, and because of the recent popularity gained by rights-based approach in climate litigation. So I've finished, and I thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Carlotta, for your fantastic presentation. Really interesting, and also very nice to see this new approach. And I'm looking forward to read more on this South African case. I think it's very appealing. I don't know, something new that I think it's really interesting. Maybe later on you can tell us a little bit more on this topic, because I think it's really, really interesting.
Sure.
So thank you so much, and thank you for sticking to the time. So I'm seeing that there are some questions on the chat and also on the question and answers. So I just wanted to let you know that after the presentations, we will have time to discuss about them, and I encourage to do the questions by yourself later on, or you can write it as you are doing already. So now we will have Julián Corredor Naranjo. Julián, you are very welcome. Julián is from the Fundación Universitaria Juan de Castellanos, and his presentation is entitled Women and Extractivism, a general overview at female public participation in the consolidation of environmental democracy in Colombia. Thank you, Julián, for joining us, and you have the floor for the next 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege for me to address you today in an event that invites us to continue reflecting on the dilemmas and difficulties of environmental law. On this occasion, as it's been said, I'm going to talk about women and extractivism in Colombia, seeking to provide a general overview of this issue related to the concept of environmental democracy. So to begin, the natural and ecosystemic wealth with which the Colombian territory has been benefited is known worldwide. Its different characteristics provide the maximum diversity in natural resources, renewable and non-renewable, and other components that, without a doubt, have had an impact on the historical and social evolution of the country. However, such natural wealth has been strongly threatened, especially in recent years, by illegal extractive activities, deforestation, air and water pollution, and even by economic activities within the framework of law, such as the exploitation of the large mines in the territory under the concept of development. In data, we can see that Colombia's biodiversity numbers are outstanding, and likewise, we can see how the country's economy, in a high proportion, depends on the export of raw materials related to fossil fuels. Such demand for goods resulting from extraction has notoriously increased environmental conflicts in the territory. Conflicts that have become more visible in the last 5 years with the signing of the peace agreement with the former guerrilla of the FARC. According to the Environment and Justice Atlas, there are around 129 environmental conflicts in the Colombian territory. However, other studies show that that number could be even close to 250. These conflicts involve matters previously mentioned, such as deforestation, water and air pollution, mining, and extractive activities, among others. With that said, the role of leadership, criticism, and opinion that women have taken in different parts of the territory has contributed to the gradual consolidation of fundamental participation scenarios for Colombian democracy. Thus, to have a general view, we see how, for example, the marches led by 400 women, Afro-descendant women, of the region of Northern Cauca in 2014 seek to manifest against illegal mining and violence in their territories. Besides, they manifested against government concessions to transnational corporations so they can exploit natural resources. In this case, we were talking about gold, the extraction of gold. These women took the case to the judicial procedures, and at the end, the Colombian Constitutional Court granted the right to prior consultation over the economic interest of foreign investors. But even though they achieved a very important step through the judicial means, there are still serious problems related to criminal bands and illegal armed groups exploiting natural resources without any legal concession. They cause land dispossession as well as forced displacement of the population in the region. In similar contexts, indigenous women from the northern region of Colombia, La Guajira, the Guajira region, have struggled with massive extraction of coal in their ancestral territories. These women have claimed their culture's vision of territory as one that sees Mother Earth as a victim of irresponsible and unsustainable exploitation of natural resources. They have raised their voices against the extractive activities of large companies in the region, since they can threaten the fundamental water supply for their families with a common practice known as river diversion. We have to add that the Guajira region suffers from serious problems of water scarcity. Therefore, demands of the indigenous groups still pending of concrete solutions by the government. Recently, we have also seen peasant women in regions such as Boyacá leading administrative and legal processes against extractive activities, mainly extraction of coal. That extraction of coal that erode the natural environment and ultimately affect the livelihoods of their families. We see then how water contamination caused by coal extraction may seriously affect crops and cattle feeding, ultimately generating serious threats to the family income and overall significant impairment of the environment. These manifestations, among other theories, have been given the name by a Colombian author, Astrid Ulloa, as territorial feminism, in the understanding that environmental conflicts are scenarios in which women, especially indigenous, Afro-descendant, and peasant women, act, lead, and organize demonstrations, opinions, and criticisms regarding the processes of the so-called development that threaten their livelihoods, traditions, and culture. We see in the presentation three main figures in what we call territorial feminisms in Latin America. But as you may know, this novel cause may attract violent responses, as with the Berta Cáceres murder in 2016. All these leadership processes led by women are, without a doubt, aiming to consolidate environmental democracy in Colombia. We have to recall that there are three main points that environmental democracy talks about. First of all, the right to participate, right to participate. Second of all, the right to access to information. And finally, the right to access to environmental justice. There have been huge steps in the political, legal, and administrative context in Colombia that have increased the degree of citizen participation in environmental matters. But foremost, women participation. As I mentioned briefly before, the scope for the active participation of women leaders in the country has been expanded, seeking to make the problems of their territory known. The Colombian constitutional state, without a doubt, recognizes a legal framework for the participation of individuals in environmental matters. However, access to information, and above all, access to environmental justice, are issues that are still pending in the country's legal and political agenda. As Global Witness report showed in 2017, Colombia is the second most dangerous country in the world for environmental leaders, just after Brazil. We have a huge opportunity to consolidate environmental democracy in Latin America with the recent Escazu Agreement on access to information, public participation, and justice in environmental matters. Colombia is still pending on ratification of this regional treaty. Finally, I must say that this is part of a research that is being carried out in a specific part of the Colombian territory, which is the region of Boyacá, where we are studying peasant women participation and leadership in environmental matters. However, the wide-known pandemic situation has made a little pause in the gathering of data. I would like to conclude my address with this quote, citing Francia Marquez, the Goldman Prize winner in 2019. I'm part of those women who use material law to take care of their territory as a space of life. I'm part of those women who raise their voices to stop destruction of rivers, forests, and the moorlands is the translation of that last word. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope this could be a good insight of what we're trying to study right now here in the University Juan de Castellanos. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Julián, for your presentation. Really interesting. I really loved that you mentioned this concept, territorial feminism. I think we are not so aware of it, and maybe later on you can explain us a little bit more about it. I think most of the audience would like to. Thank you so much. Also for keeping the time, even you have 1 minute left.
Okay.
So you did it perfectly, thank you. And also you mentioned the Escazu Agreement, and I think it's also very nice because the next presentation will deal with this topic, so it's nice to see the relationship between the panelists. So thank you, and we will have time later on to discuss further on your presentation.
Thank you. You're welcome.
So the next presentation, I'm sorry, I'm seeing that someone is asking about the presentations. They are most of them available at the website. And in case you want to have them, you just can visit our website and they are there. So the next panelists are Carlos Antonio Cruz Carrillo and Boroka Godley. They come from the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies. Thank you both for joining us in this 5th TIEC. And their presentation, as I was mentioning, it's entitled The Role of Gender in the Implementation of the Escazu Agreement, Challenges in Guaranteeing the Right of Public Participation. Thank you very much for joining us, and you have the next 10 minutes.
Thank you, Beatriz. First and foremost, thank you to the organizers for inviting us. And I think it's a very interesting scope of gender in environmental law that is very few researched. So as you mentioned, I am Carlos Cruz Carrillo, and together with my colleague Boroka Godley, we're going to talk about the role of gender in the implementation of the Escazu Agreement. So in order to do so, we are going to divide our presentation in 3 main points. So firstly, we're going to talk in a nutshell what is the Escazu Agreement in a very broad way, because it's a very complex treaty. And secondly, we're going to talk about the gender inequalities and the Escazu Agreement, particularly allocating the scenario in Latin America, which is the region that the agreement covers mainly. And as a third point, we're going to share with you some considerations that we found could be a challenge while implementing the Escazu Agreement in domestic level. So turning to the first issue, the Escazu Agreement is a regional treaty which is mainly based on the duty of states to provide various channels of participations to groups and individuals that could be potentially affected by a project or by an activity or by an environmental public policy. So the Escazu Agreement is divided or covers the so-called access rights, which are the three rights that you see in the screen: access to information, public participation in decision-making, access to justice, And the treaty incorporates a novelty, which is the obligation to protect human rights defenders concerning environmental matters. So this is a very important new obligation enshrined in the agreement that will be fundamental to balance these rights among the Latin American region. So just some comments on the Escazu Agreement. As you see, it is an environmental law treaty, but also covers human rights perspective. So that is to say, from the environmental law perspective, you have that the Escazu Agreement enshrines obligations aimed for balancing interests of the various stakeholders. And in the question of human rights, the treaty also provides for the states to guarantee the human rights to an environment and the related human rights. So this is already discussed for instance, in the inter-American system. It's a discussion that has already been triggered in the case law. So turning to the question of how the Escazu Agreement could provide some guidelines to implement agreement under a gender approach. Well, we find three main points that we consider important to share. So basically, the first one is that the Article 3 of the treaty, which established the main principles to be considered by states while implementing the treaty, incorporates the fundamental principle of international law concerning the equality and non-discrimination. This is basic while speaking about gender, and this will have intersectionalities among the treaty. The second one, and related to the principle, is that the treaty encompasses the definition persons or groups in vulnerable situations. This definition is also encompassed in many articles among the treaty, which can give a better understanding of the scope of the obligation to be performed. And thirdly, Article 7 of the Escazu Agreement concerning public participation, it's perhaps the only provision so far that clearly establishes an inclusion of gender characteristics, and this inclusion is enshrined in the obligation for the states to establish a proper allocation of social, economic, and gender characteristics of the people concerned in the enjoyment of these rights. That is to say, you as a state need to consider the particular social, economic, cultural, I will say, too, and gender characteristics to be allocated while performing these obligations. And also, paragraph 14 of this same article, Article 7, established the obligation for states to identify and eliminate barriers for public participation. So these are three main points that could be useful while implementing the Escazu Agreement. The Escazu Agreement is not yet in force, but we are close to that, since so far we have 9 ratifications from the 11 required for the treaty to be enforced. So we're almost there, but it's better for the states to start developing and adapting their domestic system in order to fulfill the obligations. So this is the law, and this is what we have in the treaty. However, how we implement these obligations in domestic level, and particularly how do we consider the gender scope while implementing these obligations in Latin America? So in order to do so, it's important to understand what is happening in Latin America concerning gender inequalities in environmental matters. And for this purpose, I will invite Boroka to share with us some thoughts about this. Boroka, go.
Yes, hello everybody. So as we've been talking about gender, I just want to first point out that I'm going to look at gender within the Latin American region, but focusing specifically on women's issues, although recognizing that gender encompasses many more identities. So as many of you may already know, the Latin American region is characterized by many socioeconomic and gender inequalities. And despite the progress made in recent years to reduce these inequalities, women do continue to face many disadvantages. And they are more likely to suffer from gender-based violence, the excessive burden of unpaid work, and the gender wage gap. So in addition to this, as previously mentioned by other presenters, women are also more likely to face the adverse effects of climate change and environmental damage, which can also be derived from extractive activities. So politically as well, women are often excluded from decision-making processes, including decisions made about their land and their local environment. So, as a result of low economic productivity, low income, and high population density, as well as limited land ownership, women have historically played a very important role in many Latin American countries in cultivating land and undertaking agricultural labor. And this is particularly the case in rural areas. They have also played an important role in defending and protecting the environment through protests, marches, occupations, as well as engagement with different local, national, and social movements, as well as women's organizations. So female activists have been known to develop and create specific policies and their own alternatives and environmental solutions in general. So yeah, as you can see, women have a lower share of agricultural kind of landowning power than males. So unfortunately, Latin America does remain a very dangerous region for women who are trying to defend their territory. According to a report by Global Witness, 83 out of 164 environmental rights defenders who were killed in 2018 were from Latin America. But unfortunately, I didn't manage to find any data about women specifically. However, there is research that shows that female defenders of the environment are exposed to different forms of violence, including sexual abuse. And their work is often ignored or belittled by authorities and legal organizations because they are women. So according to a study by Munoz about the effects of the socio-environmental conflicts on women, their bodies, lives, and territories, companies often only negotiate with men, and women can be stigmatized or condemned for disagreeing with their male community leaders and the males who make the decision around them. So there are many case studies of females involved in environmental decision-making processes in Latin America, which have different kind of outcomes. Firstly, we have the case of Berta Cáceres, who was already mentioned, who was the leader of the indigenous Lenca people and an environmental activist from Honduras, who fought and defended the rights of her people and was unfortunately killed in 2016. But there are cases with more positive outcomes. There is that of Margarita Pérez, who fought against mining in Peru. And this case was taken to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and these activities were stopped. So this was a positive example. And finally, a case which is currently in process is that of Lady Pech, who is fighting against the expansion of soy cultivation in her local town in Mexico. And the case is currently in the Inter-American Commission, so hopefully it will be decided in her favor. So having considered this, we can see that there are many different issues associated with gender and the protection of environmental activists in Latin America. So we have come up with a few kind of key considerations which should be taken into account when implementing the Escazu Agreement from a gender perspective. So first of all, we think there should be a close interaction between governments, the NGOs representing the rights of women and women during the implementation process of the agreement and in the kind of internal procedures which modify the legal frameworks So the involvement of NGOs and grassroots organizations is very important because these organizations often have more up-to-date and relevant information about the issues that local women are facing, which can include potentially taboo or sensitive concerns. These organizations might also have a greater insight into the socio-cultural norms which prevail in a different region and which may vary dependent upon region. Working with these organizations can help the government to implement effective policies and legislation which can be tailored to specific problems and really can help women to be involved in decision-making processes surrounding their land. And I'll pass you on to Carlos for the next two.
So what about the state? So the challenge for the state will entail for them to strengthen the institutions through capacity building concerning the interlinkage between women and environment. So this key link will entail also that, yeah, capacity building of the officers operating on the field that will provide or will perform these obligations. And this can be reflected in procedures such as an environmental impact assessment, mentioned, for example, by in our colleague. And also another example could be, is happening, for example, in the case of Lady Page, the prior or informed consult process. So what is important here is to trigger, to foster the participation of women in a manner that their cultural and social context should be considered at the moment of performing the obligation. So a third point will be that the state should guarantee the effective protection of human rights defenders and environmental matters. And this is important because, again, we need to consider the social, cultural, and economic context of the human rights defenders. As we see in another context of human rights defenders among Latin America, sometimes indigenous people or local communities are reluctant to comply with some, for example, precautionary measures established by the government or by inter-American system because they feel that they are abandoning their roots. So this is something that should be considered while trying to perform these access rights obligations too. And the fourth point is the importance of international and domestic adjudication. That is to say, to use the courts to fostering or pushing on governments to respect the access rights and the obligation to protect human rights defenders in environmental matters. So this is in a nutshell the scenario of the Escazu Agreement and how gender could be considered while implementing the obligations enshrined to it. So with this, we conclude our presentation. Of course, we are happy to provide some answers to the particular concerns that we mentioned during the conference. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Sorry, I think you couldn't hear what I was saying. Thank you so much, Carlos Antonio and Boroka, for your very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed this Latin American approach, and also that it was very related to the previous presentation. It was very nice. And I think it's also very original, this analysis of the Escazu Agreement through the gender lens. So thank you very much for that. And now we will move to the question and answers part of the session. So I would kindly ask all the panelists to turn on your cameras. If you could do that, then it will be more interactive. That would be lovely. Thank you all. So I've seen that we have some questions here. I forgot to say at the beginning that you could ask your questions at the question and answer feature that you have on the top-down part of your screen, and that all the assistants could vote for the questions to see which are the most interesting ones, or the ones that really want to be answered. So I encourage, for example, Francisco Camarena, he has asked 2 questions, and I think it could be nice if you could ask them yourself. I would let you talk in case you want. Let's see if it works.
Hi.
Hi, Francisco. Would you like to ask the questions by yourself?
Yes, many
Perfect.
thanks.
Thank you.
I was trying to make an argument that whether or not gender can become an argument in climate change litigation, because as you or most of you know, in local communities or rural communities, one of the sector with a strong impact of climate change are women. That's my question, whether or not gender can become a specific argument during climate change litigation.
I guess you are addressing this question to Carlotta.
I think Carlotta, because he put
Perfect.
the presentation climate public interest litigation.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. That's what I also want to understand, whether gender itself can become an argument for climate litigation. I think that it can, because human rights in general have become the center lately of climate litigation. So vulnerable groups, not only women, but indigenous groups, for example, or farmers have been using this instrument to bring their claims. And I think that public interest litigation is more suitable for including gender as a ground for climate change litigation, because it has a very relaxed standing. So normally in European courts, or also in the US courts, there is a very high threshold. I mean, it is very hard to prove that you have a differentiated perspective on climate change or on environmental issues in general. So just to argue that as a woman you are more vulnerable to climate change wouldn't work in other courts, and it has not worked, for example, in another case in Switzerland. I use this line of thought also to answer to a question of Lydia.
Thank you.
Yeah, she asked why I'm focusing on the global south rather than the global north. So the reasons are 2, as she suspected. One is that women are more affected in the global south because there are other factors for vulnerability and for inequality. And the other reasons is because I think that also with public interest litigation, there is more probability in southern courts to use gender as a matter of human rights again. So to give a more specific phase to human rights violation with gender. Yes.
Thank you, Carlotta, for answering the 2 questions already.
Welcome.
So there is another question from Araceli Cerantes. I think it would be nice if you could ask it by yourself. Let's see. Araceli, can you hear us? Do you want to make the question yourself? Otherwise,
she just wrote in the chat that her microphone doesn't work.
Okay. So Araceli was asking, thank you, Julian. Araceli was asking, I think any of you could answer this question, I think it is fair to speak of environmental feminicide, studying murdered women for defending the environment. I discovered that they do it in a more violent and exemplary way than men. Do you think that it's so? Maybe Carlos Antonio and Boroka, who were talking about environmental defenders, would develop the idea. We can't hear you. No.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, in principle, we could refer it as that, but perhaps the term in legal terminology, it's already encompassed while you talk about homicide. So I don't think that it will make that much difference if you change a bit the terminology, because it's already encompassed. What could be interesting will be the manner in how domestic level there could be a difference between a general and a specific connotation concerning the capacities and characteristics of the crime. That could be one comment on this.
Any of you would like to say anything else regarding this? Okay, so I think there are no more questions in the question and answers. Please, I encourage the audience. We have 66 participants, and so please ask your questions through this feature. You are more than welcome. We have some questions in the chat too for Karen, and I've seen that she has already answered it, but maybe it would be nice if you could explain a little further about this.
Yeah, sure. Remind me what the question was. I've now moved to the sofa with the cat.
Okay. So nice. So the question is, Maria Jurado was asking, when we speak of gender inequality and about gender and the differentiated consequences of climate change, we often conclude that we need to involve women, not binary people, people of color, Black people, people from the LGBTQA+ community, but what does it really mean? She was asking.
Yes. If you don't involve these people, all people, you do not know if there is a problem. For certain, you might think there might be. And if you don't know there's a problem, if you don't research it, if you don't document, if you don't provide data to actually back up your arguments, you weaken your position on it. So for example, I think the answer that I gave looks, we could parallel it from food security, for example, which is related to environmental issues, and where research has actually shown that food insecurity, which of course affects female-headed households more than male-headed households, actually has very statistically similar impacts on households headed by LGBTQI people as well. So actually, you might think the problems are similar, but unless you ask the question, you are speculating. Likewise, related areas, post-disaster impacts. We know that women are subject to more gender-based violence after disasters because research has been done on that. We know that particularly women who make a living through the sex trade are even more likely to be exploited in those situations, or who may have to turn to that because they have no other means of income. And I suspect from other things that I've read that a lot of LGBTQI people are in a very similar situation. But unless we ask the questions, I can only say I suspect it. I can't say I know for sure, but I'm fairly certain that there is something there to be examined. There is a question to ask. Same with climate impacts. When we're talking about LGBTQI people, we're usually talking about people who are socially disadvantaged, who are usually working in low-income jobs, who may be excluded from voting and having any sort of say in what's going on because they can't produce the right sort of documentation. You know, my birth certificate doesn't match who I am now, those sorts of things. And I think if we give that any real consideration, we can see that the gender disabilities that women suffer under are extended to the broader category of people who are different in gender terms, who are not living in the fictional male-female binary. So that's how I see it. I think there are important questions to ask. There is research to be done here.
Thank you so much, Karen, for your answer. There was another question from Manuela. You already replied back, but I think it would be nice if you could comment a little bit that we have this time. And she was asking also for Carlotta. She was asking if you think that climate litigation is a useful tool to address gender inequality issues, given that most courts are composed by male judges. Thank you, Manuela, for this question. Very interesting.
Who do you want to go first, Beatriz?
Okay. Yeah, that is a good point. Indeed, it's a point raised also in the literature that I've read with regard to the use of public interest litigation, for example, in India. What some authors argue is that it is more likely that that the judges in the Supreme Court are, even though they are mostly men, they will have a less sexist thought, or they are also interested in advancing women's rights and gender inequality. So it is more likely that the Supreme Court, it is in the specific frame of public interest litigation, does that than a local court. And I think it would be very interesting to see the outcome of this Maria Khan case, because the Pakistani Supreme Court has been very receptive to climate change and human rights related arguments. And so I think it will be interesting to see how it responds to this specific question, again, to a matter of climate justice when it is brought from the perspective of women. And probably the outcome of the case will help answering your question.
Yeah, don't assume that men can't be feminists. We can be allies when it comes to equality. I am not LGBTQI, but I would consider myself an ally. I am as white as you can get, but I would consider myself an ally to people who are claiming Celtic type 1. Very white. But I would consider myself an ally to anybody who's suffering from race-based or color-based inequality. Likewise, I'm able-bodied. I can still identify with people who are disabled in their search for equality. Good judges can do that. We may need more training because psychology suggests that we tend to regard our perspective on things as normal. And we need to actually, sometimes, most of us can work out that other people might think or experience things differently from me. But training can correct that. So actually getting people to look at their implicit biases, to look at their worldview, and to actually recognize that it's not the only way of seeing things, doing things, or being. So yes, judges are certainly capable of that. And if you think about most of the landmark cases on gender inequality, more generally, were decided by male-dominated benches. So there's hope.
Thank you, Karen. I've seen that Tehendra Pratap would like to make a question. So I will just give you this. So I think. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I had a question regarding the idea of how extractivism that is much more a kind of idea which impacts a woman's life is in very drastic manner actually. So how can we theorize in gender sense that the policy level can be more effective in order to engender and minimize the impact of extractivism in terms of mining resources and yeah.
Thank you. I guess your question is for Julián.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. I guess if I listened correctly, your question is addressing the issue of how can we like involve women in public policy regarding to extractivism. I think I'm not quite sure, but here's the thing. In the case of Latin America, as I mentioned before in the presentation, there's a concept that I found very interesting. It's about a territorial feminism, and this is kind of a research that is being carried out. It's been carried out in the National University here in Colombia, and it stands out for a different, kind of a different perspective, a new relationship between the economic perspective or the economic item, we can say that, and the environment. And here's the thing. Around 1997, there was a conference in Latin America and Chile about feminism, and they recognized that indigenous women, peasant women, and Afro-descendant women have a really interesting view of their environment, have a kind of a different relationship than if we could say white women in the Western civilization. So it stands out that the public policy and the legal system, they have to be aware of these differences, and they have to be counting on these perspectives so we can kind of build up a public policy that integrates these new visions. For example, in the matter related to extractivism, we see in the case of the northern region here in Colombia and the Cauca region, how these Afro-descendant women have been living around since the 1600s. They've been living there for around 400 years, and they even have this ancestral mining so they can support their families, and they can have like a good livelihood, if we can say that. And that is one contrast, because the legal system didn't recognize at first these traditional activities, this traditional mining. I think the strong influence of the economic view, the traditional view of development that we have been having here since 1950 has had an impact on what here in Latin America we consider of development and so forth. But I think it is really important to integrate those visions, to consider those visions as part of the territory, as part of the public policy, and take into account the women participation in these scenarios. It's crucial, so we can build kind of a fair mining policy, if you could call it like that. But well, it's just kind of a general idea. I think that's why you were trying to ask, but I couldn't hear very well.
So do you think that that the idea of extractivism we see in literature has been not as said, that it is not limited to the extracting the mining resources only, and it is more than the kind of a way to support a exploitative system or exploitative economic system, and which is based on the growth imperative actually. So in such process, the woman's basically doesn't get much to say in the process of policy making basically. And so how we can ensure their voices, because most of the time what we see that they are become a front line dissent. They come on the streets for to participate in a movement in any kind of, but whenever it's the benefit out of for any policy, or if any movement comes, it's always appropriated among the men actually. I don't find very conclusive remark till now that where women can have also not appropriated, because there is appropriation of gender at every level. So what do you say about it?
Well, here's the thing. There is this idea that mining, from centuries, we have this idea that mining, it's a male exclusive matter. And I think that is the point that we have to, first of all, change. Because, for example, in the case that I was talking about, they're not only male, they're not only like men working there in the mining sector. There are women who work there, and with all considered aspects, they have been like diminished, they have been ignored in public spaces, because we have this idea that mining and extractive industry is just for men, and I think that is a point that we have to clarify at the beginning if you want to build a public policy that involves women in these processes. So after that, probably we'll have these scenarios with environmental agreements like the Carlos were mentioning in his presentation, the Escazu Agreement, the legal system and the political system. Obviously, they have to provide these scenarios. So this differentiated like aspect, or like discrimination, if we can call it like that, just men saying, telling what to do in mining industries. It's kind of a, I don't know, it doesn't fit very well if we're talking about human rights, public participation. I think that we have to change the idea and involve this population, this women population that are contributing enormously to the benefits of the environment, families, and livelihoods in this kind of sector. So.
Thank you for the questions, and Julián for answering back. I'm sorry, but we have already consumed the time for questions and answers. Maybe if any of you would like to make any short comment or say anything that you haven't had the time to do it, you have 1 or 2 minutes left to do it. I guess we are all fine. Okay, so thank you very much to all of you for joining us during this evening for the first panel of the colloquium. It was very, 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 very nice to have you, and I hope one day we can meet in person and meet in Tarragona, which is a very nice city. I'm sure you could enjoy it very much, this beautiful city of Tarragona. So you are very welcome to visit it anytime. Well, maybe not now, but later on. So I just wanted to remind you that we are working on a shared document for the conclusions, and especially for the panelists and for Karen. If you would like to add any commentaries on it, we have just shared the link on the chat, and any conclusion, any thought you have, it will be very welcome. Also to the audience, if you would like to add anything, it's also open to anyone who wants to say anything. It's a live document, so we will work on it during these 2 days. Thank you so much. Then I have to tell you that we will meet at 6:15 in the second panel. We will close this one, and for those who have registered, we will move to the second one in almost nearly half an hour, a little bit less. Thank you so much. And I hope, to meet you again in another circumstances. And I wanted to say thank you to the organizing committee, and especially to Stephanie Asensio, who has been behind this session, and she has been helping so much to the development of this panel. Without her, this wouldn't have happened. So thank you, everyone, and see you in the next panel. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.